I'll ask if everyone could mute themselves, that'd be great. Okay. So, Chris, go ahead and unmute yourself and introduce yourself, and then carry on with whatever you have to say to us tonight. That's great.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jennifer. And I didn't realize that you were going to be at the presentation this morning, so you already got a sneak peek of exactly what I'm going to be presenting today. I'm just going to get right to the PowerPoint and provide you some of the details of some of the work that we have been doing with respect to boat wakes in Northern Ontario within cottage country. Now, I should start out by noting that the picture that you see in the background is Whitestone Lake, and that is the cottage lake that I have been going to for nearly 40 years. Well, my last name is Hauser. I am a Breer, I'm a Moor, I'm a Ward, and my parents lived directly in Parry Sound, and really I grew up in the Huntsville Parry Sound area. And so what I'm going to be focusing on is a little bit of the work that we've done in Whitestone, some work that we've done in Lake Muskoka this past summer, and introduce the study that we would like to be working on next year in Manitouwabing, because it does represent a very unique coast. Now, feel free to use throughout this time the chat. I'll be able to follow it directly as we are going through the presentation. So if there is a question that you might have, please use the chat. I will then try to answer it on the fly as I see it come up.
Premier Heather Stephenson says $200 million plan will add 2,000 staff and
one second here.
We've seen as a result of the pandemic, the strain that
There's
is
somebody with a microphone on. I'm going to try to figure out who that is.
Here in Manitoba, but across our country. And I think it's really important the work that has taken place so far, working collaboratively with those states.
I got it. All right. So just as some background to myself, as I mentioned, I grew up within the region, but I've spent most of my career in the United States. I've been in the University of Windsor since 2016. I am normally the Dean of Science. Currently, I'm the Interim Vice President, Research and Innovation. I'm a professor in the School of the Environment. And a lot of the work that I do within the Great Lakes, within the Maritimes, focuses on coastal erosion and looking at how coastal systems respond to and recover from large storms. And if you saw any of the footage of Hurricane Fiona when it hit PEI and some of the beach erosion photographs, that is actually our research group and who has been doing that work. We also do a lot of work with respect to rip currents and beach safety, both within the Great Lakes, as well as within the Gulf of Mexico and Costa Rica. And our work was responsible for new legislation in Costa Rica to put lifeguards on every major tourist beach. And more recently, and largely because of the pandemic, we started working on boat wakes because we couldn't go very far but beyond the cottage. Prior to joining the University of Windsor, I was at Texas A&M University for 9 years. And prior to that, I was at the University of West Florida in Pensacola, just near the Alabama border. And as I've said, I'm a coastal geomorphologist. It means that I look at how these coastal systems change due to storms or things such as anthropogenic forces such as boat wakes. Now, where I got my start doing boat wakes was back in 2008. And we had been asked by the National Park Service of the United States to look at the impact of Panamax and post-Panamax ships on the Savannah River. Panamax refers to ships that can go through the Panama Canal. Post-Panamax are the larger ships that they were trying to figure out. They would have to go a different route, and they would be much larger than would be able to be handled in the Panama Canal. Savannah is one of the largest ports in the United States, and these ships were coming in on a regular basis, both in terms of cargo, but also in terms of liquid natural gas. And the concern was, at Fort Pulaski, is that the marsh environment was eroding. That marsh was protecting an old Civil War pier, and that pier was adjacent directly to that of the fort. And the belief was that, in fact, these large ships that were coming down were producing the wakes that were causing the erosion. But as you can see in the little inset picture, you can see this what's called a pilot boat. Pilot boats are the boats that take the river pilots from the Savannah area out to the ocean to then pick up the pilot, get on the ship, and that pilot then brings the ship back up the Savannah River. And it was believed that it was those big waves of the Panamax ships that were the problem, but it wasn't. It was actually these smaller pilot boats. And what was happening, these waves, and you can see them in this bottom picture, would come in and hit the edge of the marsh. And as they hit the edge of the marsh, they would scarp it, and in that scarping, eventually it would retreat. But that really wasn't the bigger problem. The bigger problem, as you can see in the main picture, were the oyster shells. The oyster shells were put down by the Army Corps of Engineers many years before that as a way to try to protect the coast from these ship wakes. But oyster shells move, and as a result, they moved along the coast and they smothered the vegetation. As a result, the vegetation died, the waves were no longer attenuated, and the marsh started to erode very quickly. So it's a bit of a lesson here that these ships were important, but also sometimes the way in which we try to fix it may actually be much more detrimental. And anytime you put in any type of shoreline protection, a break wall, rocks, etc., you're automatically changing the sediment budget in a way that will impact everybody who is downdrift of you. Once one person puts in a break wall, puts in a jetty, everybody along that section of the shoreline will also need to do so. But this is really what I wanted to focus on, is that these ships, when they came through, whether the Panamax ships or the pilot boats, what they were doing is they were creating a considerable increase in the cross-shore velocity. That is the speed of the wave that is moving in and out towards the shoreline. And it was fluctuations of almost 50 centimeters per second. That is quite a large fluctuation and change that then caused the sediment on the bottom to be lifted up at concentrations that were much higher than the local wind waves could generate. As a result, because this was on a tidal environment, on a river, once that sediment was resuspended and it was muddy, it tended to move further down the coast. It was literally lost from this marsh environment. So we knew that, in fact, boat wakes were a problem at this location. Now, obviously, we're talking about something that is a far grander scale than Manitouwabing, than any of the cottage country lakes. But I wanted to give you an idea as to where we started with our boat wake research. During the pandemic, or just before the pandemic, we started to do some work with a place called Lake Conway. And it was the Lake Conway Cottage Association or Homeowners Association that asked us to look at the impact of wake boats on the local shoreline. Now, what's interesting about Lake Conway is that the president of the Wakeboarding Association, a lobby group in the United States, has their house directly on this lake. And this lake also is where the Australian wakeboard team practices during the Australian winter. So on a given day, these wake boats were going past about 50 times within about 200 feet of the shoreline. And as you can just see in the background, it's a very dense lake. It's a grass right down to the edge of the lake, very similar to what you see at Manitouwabing, in where you got that grass coming straight down and much more of a vegetated shoreline in some areas. Here you had that same issue. These wake boats were believed to be causing problems. So I was asked to better understand what is the impact. This also happened to be the lake that the Wakeboarding Association did their own study to look at the impact of waves. And their ultimate conclusion is that these wake boats that you just saw in that last picture were having no impact whatsoever on the shoreline. And in fact, they were smaller than the wind waves. And that's what we were wanting to test. What you see in this graph here is what happens to boat wakes when they're generated. So starting with the bottom, what you have on the y-axis, on the vertical, is basically the water surface elevation going up and down with each wake. And on the x along is the time in seconds. So what you have is you're looking at what a wake would look like. So here, the very first wake being generated by the boat had a height of over 20 inches. That's actually quite a large wake. That's 50-centimeter wake that was being generated by this boat. But as it moved to the next sensor along, what happens is that the longest waves travel faster. So bigger waves travel faster than smaller waves. And boat wakes disperse. They spread out like an accordion, where the larger waves go faster and the smaller waves trail behind. So as you go from the spot where a boat wake is generated, and you move further and further away from the sailing line, the boat wake spreads out. And as it spreads out, just like as you're pulling an accordion apart, the waves get smaller. Now they get smaller because you're dispersing, you're pulling that accordion apart, but they also begin to get smaller simply because of dissipation. They're pushing against a flat water surface, they're losing energy, and they get smaller. The point is that the further you go away from the sailing line of a boat, the smaller the waves will get. But the Wakeboard Association believed that in fact, it was having no impact. So this is what it looks like in distance. So the y-axis here is the height of the wave in inches. So some of the largest waves were 25 to 30 inches in height. And on the x-axis is the distance from the boat track. And so what you're seeing is that dissipation or the loss in energy of that boat wake away. And they ran 6 different tests: wake surf deep, wakeboard deep, cruising deep, whole bunch of different combinations. And what you can see here is that some of these wakes, like a wakeboard shallow, dissipates fairly readily from almost 21 inches in terms of the wave height when it was first generated, all the way down to about 4 inches. But some of the other wakes, like a wakeboard in deep water, really doesn't dissipate. It might have started out again around that 23 inches, but it's still about 10 inches in height over 300 feet or 100 meters away from the sailing line. So this is the data that was being used to lobby in the US government, in the federal government, to say that wake boats were having no impact on the shoreline, and particularly on this Lake Conway in Florida. So what we wanted to do is do a little bit of a study as to whether this was happening. So you can see in this video here, a wake boat going right past. It's going well within 200 feet of the shoreline. And you can see the wake that's being generated and is coming in. What you should also notice is as the wake's coming in, and it's going to take a second here, look at the hardened shoreline that they have put in there. The cement along the shoreline, a little jetty, or little groin off to the side. That tells you that this shoreline was eroding, that they had to put up protective structures. And they put up those protective structures because of the wakes. And so here you can see that wake coming in. It would have came straight in towards the shoreline. The long waves are now approaching. The shorter waves are going to be coming in. Those shorter waves tend to be a little bit larger in height. But one of the things that this particular owner had to do was change their docking system to a floating one that actually was broken apart so that it could be able to not take that shearing force of these wakes coming in. So this was some of the evidence that they were sending to me saying, hey, the Wakeboard Association says these aren't a problem, but look at my dock is askew. My dock is being impacted. I've had to harden my shoreline. So we did a study, and I put a paragraph up there, which you've been able to read, but we did a study, and what we did is we did an estimate of the wind speeds. And we took that lake and we said, okay, let's pretend the boat is going in one direction, and then we pretend the boat's going in a different direction. And using wind data from near Disneyland, we then were able to predict what were the wind waves that would be generated on that lake. And what we found is that, in fact, an individual boat passage where they said these boats were passing in the middle of the lake represented only a couple of percentages of the wind waves. So in fact, inconsequential. But the problem with what they said is that in fact, that the boats were going down the middle. I know, I water ski, family water skis. You don't always go down the middle. You got to turn. There are many times when you are closer to the shoreline. And in fact, when we started looking at some of the videos and some of the photographs, we realized that the boats were not down the middle, as was assumed by the Wakeboard Association. They were much closer to the shoreline. So we reversed the analysis. I'm not going to get into the data. I will provide you with this PowerPoint later on. But what we did is we said, okay, if these boats are traveling 50 times a day, how close would they have to be to represent 100% of the wave energy? And what we found, and I'm just going to point to these first couple of, just one second here. Oh, I don't have drawing tools on this one. But what we found is that when the boats were traveling within 700 to 900 feet of the shoreline, so within 300 meters of the shoreline, the boats, those waves were 100% of the boat wake energy, of the wind wave energy, which means 50 passes a day on a wakeboard, on a wake boat, was in fact as much or more than the wind waves on this shoreline. These wakes were in fact much greater than the wind that would have been generated on this small lake. What we've also noticed is that with the shoreline revetments, with the changes in the docks, that in fact it was causing the damage and forcing the cottage owners to change up their shoreline. Now, this didn't go anywhere because the pandemic hit and the Cottage Association ran out of funding to sue the Wakeboard Association. And in fact, nothing has actually changed on this particular lake. So during the pandemic, we are obviously stuck, and many of us were stuck at cottages. And this is actually on, again, Whitestone Lake in Dunchurch. And this is one of our little towboats that we have, and it's going up the long arm area just from Dead Man's Point. And we're coming out of a narrow section, and as we're coming out of it, the boat's pretty laden with people. We're now starting to speed up above the 10 kilometers. We're generating a very large wake in this very narrow area, even though we are within regulation. So it raised the question, as I was looking at some of these imagery and sitting on the dock, how in fact were these potentially having an impact? So one of the questions I just see in the chat is that when do you have multiple boats traveling in opposite directions, do they multiply the effect? They don't multiply the effect, but they're additive. So every time you have one wake, it adds to the other, it adds to the other. They don't cancel each other out. They come in at different angles, and basically you create an entire chain of waves that will come into the shoreline. I really do apologize for the really bad drone flying on this particular video. I'm literally in that boat trying to fly the drone behind us simultaneously, and it turns out I'm not very good at flying a drone while also driving in a boat. So these boats, when they do happen, so that boat just passed us in this picture, you can see its wake, our wakes are going to be added directly to that. Now, this is my son on one of the boats that we used that summer in 2020. And what he is doing is demonstrating both a displacement, the very simple. Now he's going into plow mode at a slightly faster speed, generating a very large wake. And very soon, now I should note here, I almost just crashed the drone at that exact moment into the water. But what he did is he was able to demonstrate how a boat starts in displacement, no wake, and then he goes into plow and ultimately moves into the full planing mode. So what you have is that the size of a wake that is generated by a boat depends upon the size of the boat, the shape of it, the weight of it, but it also would then depend upon the speed in which the person is traveling. Are they in displacement and perfectly flat? Are they plowing and pushing into the water surface, or are they at plane and basically skimming along the surface? One of the other controls is that of depth. So we tend to think of boat wake regulations with respect to speeds in the distance from a shoreline, 30 meters from shore. But when you're close to shore, and even in some of our smaller lakes in the Parry Sound region, you've got shallow areas. You may be well beyond 30 meters from shoreline, but you're in shallow water. So as a result, when you change the depth, you also change the structure of the waves, the orientation in which they move towards the shoreline, and the size. And as you move from deep to shallow water, you're also getting to a spot where your prop wash is able to penetrate all the way down to the bottom of the water. When you penetrate down to the water, that's when you are starting to pick up some of that finer material, the mucks that are down there. You are also mixing the water column, which means that you're taking the warm water from above and dropping it down further. So normally our lakes turn over temperature-wise with respect to heating on the surface. Here, once you start adding boats, you're adding to what would be the wind wave mixing, and as a result, throwing it down. So Carrie asked in the question here, are you going to be testing the energy going down, causing disturbance of the lake bottom by propeller wash? That's a really tough one to be able to measure. So you can look at it. If you actually put in like a fish finder right behind your boat, you can see how deep your prop wash will actually go. And it's quite substantial. But being able to measure right on that prop wash, you've got to be directly under the sailing line. So what we are planning to do, instead of looking directly at the prop wash, is using two proxy measures. The first one being the fine particulate matter that may be resuspended by the washes that are going in a bunch of different sailing lines, as well as the changes in temperature on a daily cycle to see how individual boats as they move through may be in fact mixing that water. So we're going to do it indirectly versus directly below, because we don't, in many of our lakes, have a single sailing line in which to be able to follow. Now, while we were doing this, we then started to look at, and we put in some pressure sensors on the lake. And so this is again on Whitestone Lake. It's an old 1960s boat that is moving down towards the marina, right down towards the bridge at Whitestone. And it's now in displacement mode, but because of its weight, and despite the fact that it is within the speed limits, it's producing a fairly sizable wake as we move down this small section. So what we did is we put out a pressure sensor within at Whitestone Lake to look at what was in fact the size of the wakes that were actually hitting the shore, coming into the shoreline. And so you can see an example of that in the bottom. The bottom little graph shows you X along the X-axis. That is going to be your time in seconds. And along the Y-axis, that is your water depth. Now, these are relatively small waves, so they're just a couple of centimeters in height. But what you should notice is that at the very beginning, at 0 seconds, the mean water level, MWL, is almost perfectly flat. And then the wake comes towards the pressure sensor, and you get this very large wake that almost lasts for 75 seconds to 100 seconds. But what was surprising, and the first time that it was ever recorded looking in a boat wake study, are the reflected waves. Now you can see in the background of this picture, and if you've been on Whitestone and many of the lakes in the Parry Sound region, they got bedrock shorelines. Those bedrock shorelines are perfect reflectors. So these wakes that are being generated by this boat are coming into the shoreline, hitting the rocks, and going straight back out to the lake. As a result, the wake, which was only about 75 to 100 seconds, lasts almost 300 seconds. But what is even more surprising is that, again, look at how flat the water was before the wake comes in. And then look at how ripply the water is afterwards. Now, these are negligible waves. But if you ever sat at your dock and looked at the water and there's no wind and there's always just kind of a rippled pattern to it, and we've noticed this many times on Whitestone, is those are actually all of the residual wakes that have been reflected back and forth across the lake and are still being dissipated. Now, they don't do much. And I can't tell you whether from this particular picture, whether this wake is going to have an impact on the shoreline, it's going to have an impact on infrastructure. The reason why we are doing this study is to be able to better understand how much of an energy source are they, and what does that mean in terms of how we study them going further. So just as some background, this is Whitestone Lake in a simple map. Dunchurch is directly here in the middle. So Duck Rock would be right at this location, right at this location. And our cottage is right on Moore Lane, right by the public school. We put the pressure sensor in there, and we're right down one of the long fetches of the lake with a very strong west wind, which means that when the wind does start to blow, we get some very large waves that come down. And while we were, that particular spot is also the main entrance point to the entire northern section of the lake, and the main sailing line from the marina and the bridge is directly in front of the cottage. So what we did is we took this pressure sensor and we left it in from May to September. And in that May to September time, we started to look at which were waves and which were wakes. Now, I'll show you how we separate those a little bit later. But what we were finding, and we first looked at the wind waves. So right here, right at the very beginning of June, we had a big frontal storm come through and some big waves were generated. And then through the kind of right at the beginning of July, again, some very strong frontal winds, later July and into August. And you can see this kind of almost daily cycle or daily to weekly cycle of wind waves coming through the system. And on Whitestone, we do get almost the equivalent of a sea breeze that will pick up through the middle of the afternoon. You can see that in that daily cycle. But what we then did is we took that data and we removed that of the boat wakes, and we added those ones up as well. And you can see Canada Day, civic holiday, the August civic holiday, and the Labor Day holiday, just how much boat wake activity there was compared to that of the wind waves. So when you take all that energy and you sum it up, you get the cumulative energy. That cumulative energy tells us how much that shoreline has been impacted. And what we found is that the recreational boats accounted for 60% of all wave energy in summer 2020. Now that is just the wake. That is not the reflected wave. That's not the residual waves. That is just the main wake that was coming to the shoreline. It was far greater than I had ever expected. But when you look at it and you start realizing how much reflected and residual wave there is, you can see it in this picture. So just to give you an idea, this is the main channel coming from the river. The marina is just down in this picture. Dunchurch is off to the right-hand side of the photograph, and the cottage where the sensor was is just outside of the frame of the photo on the right. But in this picture, you should be able to see that, in fact, there are 7 different wakes. You got this main boat going through, you got another one coming in the background, but then if you count all the reflected wakes that are coming in on the different sides, this represents 7 different wave trains all in the same location. But what was really interesting about this particular shot is that this shot was taken on a day with no wind. It was calm. Look at how rippled the surface of the water is. That's your residual wave. So here what you've got is a direct wake that accounts for 60% of the energy. Reflected waves, which count for 80% of the energy, and simply a changed water surface. Again, I don't know if that means anything, but rather it's telling you that in fact waves and wakes are a primary source of energy on Whitestone Lake, at least in summer 2020. Now, summer 2020, at the very beginning in the May season, it was really high water levels. And so right here, you should be actually seeing a cement dock. Well, that cement dock was simply covered by the water. The pump system had to be put up on a pallet just to get it out of the water. And now you have a boat wake coming straight across. We couldn't even put in the main docks because of the height of the water. The reason for showing this photograph is that depending upon the wake and water level, you can change the impact to the shoreline. Boat wakes may not have an impact in times where in fact the water levels are low, but they might have an impact when water levels are high, or vice versa. Because also when the water levels are low, you're actually now closer to the bottom and your prop wash can actually get all the way down. So one of the main variables that needs to be understood is how does water levels, how does temperature, how does the activity on the lake and sailing lines and types of boats, how do those all play into this? Now, one of the things that we're going to be looking at next year is that of shoreline habitat. And what's really interesting on Whitestone Lake, and I haven't done a lot more of a survey in other areas, and I'd like to look a little bit more in Amic and Wawashkesh, is that where the shoreline habitat is, where the marshes are, how they are oriented with respect to wind waves, and how they may have changed historically, potentially as a result of boat wakes, if at all. Again, we don't know. We don't know what is that threshold that may cause damage. We just know that they're adding a significant source of energy. Now, one that was surprising was that of jet skis. Personal watercrafts are typically identified as straight line, really having no wakes. But when jet skis are in the middle, and I can tell you, they're a lot of fun to do exactly what's shown here. I do it. It's fun. You get these wakes, but just look at how many wakes are on this lake. Jet skis, when they start to go in circles and jump, they are producing a lot of energy. Again, I don't know if that makes a difference. I don't know. We don't know yet if how much that propagates down may cause erosion or not. What it is, we need to better understand it. Again, we're just understanding that in fact, what we're seeing here in terms of the vessels are in fact greater than that of the wind waves. So in the last year, this past summer, with the support of Quiet Safe Lakes, we put a bunch of pressure sensors directly back throughout Lake Muskoka and Lake Joseph. We also put the sensors back up in Whitestone as our control to figure out whether boat activity in a given year might have changed. And again, we wanted to look at Muskoka because it's a very different lake, much larger, much more complex, and whether in fact we would also be seeing that same importance of boat wakes in the region. So we then just kind of mimic that study, but with greater orientations, etc. Now, I apologize, I'm not going to get it too much into the detail of what these actually show you, but I'm just going to show you data from one particular day, June 11th, 2022. This is at the beginning of June. It's still not very warm. There's still not a lot of boats out on Lake Muskoka and Lake Joseph. And you typically get a lot more wind waves associated with frontal storms. So what we did is we put them out, and there's two sites that I'm going to show you here. The first one, the top one, is up in the northern, kind of the northwestern section of Lake Joseph. The second one is closer to that of Windermere. On the one, in terms of on the top, what you see is, again, along the x-axis, that is time in seconds. On the y-axis is essentially millimeters to centimeters of elevation change of the water surface. So this is 4,000 seconds, more than an hour of data. And what we then did is we used what's called wavelet analysis. So essentially, this is just a series of waves. And with wavelet analysis, we're able to pull those apart, just like that accordion which I mentioned before, pull those apart and separate them out to big waves and little waves and the structure of them. In a boat wake, I'm going to go to the bottom picture here. A boat wake is easily identified as this inverted comma type structure. And so we can see them here. There's one here, there's one here, there's a couple in here. These little inverted structures. Once we know where those inverted structures are, we can separate those out, pull them directly out of here. And if we add up all those colors in this wavelet plot, you get the total energy of the wave. So we pulled out the wakes, we left the rest of them as wind waves, and we were able to figure out how much the wake represented. So at the first spot in the northwest section of Lake Joseph, the wakes were present 60% of the time, but they only represented 38% of the energy, simply based upon the fetch. It's a much wider open area. The wind was coming from a direction that allowed for larger waves. In the bottom section, down here towards Windermere, here on that exact same day, in the exact same hour, boat wakes represented 24% of the time, but were 58% of the energy. So the point of showing you this is that when it comes to boat wakes, they're not always a problem. Some days they are, some water levels they are, some boat types are. Sometimes it's cumulative. Sometimes they're not any greater than that of a wind wave. We don't have enough information to understand when in fact they're of the same energy as a wind wave, and what then might be the threshold at which they do cause some type of damage to the shoreline. This past summer, we also ran a study in a little lake called Lake Roslin. Lake Roslin is just outside of Hanover in central Ontario. It's a very small lake, only maybe 500 meters across, but on this lake, there's a number of kayaks and 3 wake boats. Very small lake, hard to get any big wind waves generated. And so what I did is I picked a given week throughout August 20th to the 26th. And what you see is that, again, time is along the x-axis, water depth is on the y. And so it's very, very flat throughout the evening. And then there's the first fisherman going out. And then all of a sudden, around 8 to 9 o'clock in the morning, that's when your boats start to get very, very active. And then they shut down around 9 o'clock at night. There was almost a perfect diurnal signal where you'd get no activity, flat water, lots of boat wakes, and then down. Here's the entire data set for the entire month of August. And again, you see that same pattern. Very busy during the day, flat water during the night, busy during the day, flat water during the night. Now, one of the reasons why the graphs do vary in overall, they have these bigger waves that you can see in this bottom picture for the entire month, is that they're measuring pressure. So they're also measuring atmospheric pressure, changes in highs and lows. We have to sort that out yet. The reason for doing the study on Lake Roslin is because they have a very big problem with algal blooms. And they've really started to pick up in recent times. Those algal blooms, they believe, is because of the prop wash getting down to the bottom. This lake may be only 2 meters deep in total. So as a result, they're thinking that it might be picking up those that bottom sediment, mixing the water. And so you can see a bit of the algal bloom here in this picture. I apologize, a little pixelated tonight. This algal bloom right here, there's one of the boats coming through within the region, and it's a very shallow environment. Resuspending sediment is very common within this lake, as well as you are automatically, almost with every boat passage, changing that water temperature profile. And again, we're finding that 80%, sorry, almost 100% of all the wave energy on this lake is simply due to boats. So we see this in other locations. This is data from Tampa in Florida. And the reason for showing it, I think it's just one of the better images of boat wakes, and sorry, of prop wash. It's what we're seeing in Lake Roslin. The boat goes through, the prop wash penetrates all the way down to the bottom and resuspends sediment, resuspends nutrients, potentially as a source of nutrient loading within a lake, leading to algal blooms. In addition to any of the sediment that is lost from the shoreline due to erosion, and then in addition to any washout from the yards, etc., of any type of nutrients. So prop wash may in fact be one source of that nutrient loading. So what we are wanting to do next year in 2023 is run the same study on Manitouwabing. Now, one of the reasons for running it on Manitouwabing is that Manitouwabing has a very complex shape. It is an artificial lake that was dammed in the late 1800s, which means it doesn't have shorelines that are naturally in equilibrium with that of the wind. And so this is one particular spot. It's through the Narrows near McKellar. And I apologize again for the really bad videography here, but you can see that this shoreline has in fact eroded back, and now you've got bedrock that is exposed. That bedrock wasn't there previously. It used to be vegetated. And you can also see that on the next property over, they've now put in rocks to protect their shoreline. So I see a question in the chat about effective barrier is, do marshes provide effective barriers? Yes and no. Vegetation is very effective at attenuating both wind waves and boat wakes, but you need a considerable width of marsh in order to attenuate the wake. So you can just take that little boat that's coming through in the top picture. It's generating a wake that may be 5 to 10 centimeters in height. That would probably need nearly 30 meters of marsh in which to be fully attenuated. Now, it may be less marsh to be attenuated to a height that has no impact on the shoreline, but we don't have good information in the literature on how effective marshes are for doing that shoreline retreat. We do have a study that we ran at Pesh Island on the Detroit River this past year, and we're finding that vegetation in very small sections actually is not very effective at boat wakes, particularly with large cabin cruisers going down the Detroit River. So what we're looking at doing next year in 2023 is to begin looking at, again, continue our work and better understanding the relative importance of wakes in Northern Ontario lakes. We're also going to be expanding and starting to look at wake dispersion by vessel type, sea speed, and sailing line. To also look at the impact of boat wakes and sound on shoreline habitat, to better understand what is that level of marsh that might be needed. Also areas where we know we have ongoing erosion, and can we link it to wind wave and or boat wakes, or the combination of the two, and get a much better understanding of the public perception of boat wakes. I see in the chat here, Melanie writes, connects Carl's study to increase nutrients in the end of our lake near Gooseneck at Herdville. It is particularly shallow and the soil is full of clays, full of nutrients. That's exactly right. So you've got two parts here. One, you've got prop wash that might be getting down and then resuspending sediments. But as the wake then approaches the shoreline and impacts that shoreline, is that it's going to actually going to be eroding off of the shoreline and into the water. So I think it's potentially a combination of both, but we actually really don't know. No one has actually studied that. There's been some work done in Minnesota, and it wasn't very well done, unfortunately, so I don't think it's been published yet. And the work done that was done in Tampa, not a lot's being done again in the Muskoka Lake. So going back to one of the previous questions by Carrie about prop wash, that is one of the things that we need to better understand. So is this work just of UW, or are you working further with Safe Quiet Lakes? So Safe Quiet Lakes invited us to work on Lake Muskoka. All the work that we are doing is simply University of Windsor research. It is being done by both graduate and undergraduate students. It is not paid for by any organization. It is associated with an internal grant at the University of Windsor. We just, Safe Quiet Lakes just simply provided us access to the shorelines. So with that, I'm going to open it up to any questions, Jennifer, that people might in fact have. And I will let you, I can direct the question.
Sure. If anyone is on the telephone, just go ahead and speak if you have a question. Or if you're able to put your question in the chat, then go ahead and do that. It's really quite marvelous to have Manitouwabing be a part of this research, because there's quite a lot of concern about boat wakes on Manitouwabing, and it'll feel like we're actually getting somewhere just to know what we have and be able to sort that out. I see Daryl Moffat has a question. Daryl, yeah, go ahead.
Thanks very much. It was a great presentation. I also attended Safe Quiet Lakes this morning, but I missed your presentation, Chris. I guess the one thing, I'm a prior counselor in Seguin Township, and I know Carrie Mueller's on the line and she's got her mic off, but one of the biggest things you noted, or one of the biggest things that we found, was education, and you can't fix stupid. And you mentioned that in your presentation, and I'm just wondering, where does that kind of sit in the grand scheme of things? Obviously research and everything will dictate, where you go, but that seems to be a big gap that, I'm not sure how Safe Quiet Lakes or anyone can fix that, because it doesn't matter. It seems that no matter what you say or tell anyone, it's like, it's my boat. I want to do what I want and piss on everyone else that has a shoreline that gets wrecked or a dock or whatever.
No, exactly. And I will also note, and you saw the pictures of my kids driving boats and water skiing and everything else. It's a lot of fun. So when you're out there, you want to have that experience. And so it's education is going to be key. But what actually triggered this study at Whitestone was their Facebook page. So there's a Facebook page called I Have a Cottage on Whitestone. And I was just fascinated in 2019 by the discussions about boat wakes, whether they were a problem, whether they were not a problem, what areas of the lake were having greater issues than not. And there was a lot of perception, not a lot of data, not a lot of measurements. So one of the reasons what we realized is that while we're not in the game of regulations or anything else like that, we wanted to provide real data as to where are the impacts, how they might be affecting different sections of shoreline, because that will then feed into some of this education. And it goes into potentially if a community wants to do a regulation in particular areas of a lake or in general on a lake. So what we're hoping to be able to do is just provide more evidence, whether it's a problem or not, so that it can be then thought of from an education standpoint and from a regulation standpoint. But education, working in a university system, I know quite well that sometimes there's you can say as much as you want, but that doesn't necessarily mean it resonates.
Just to follow up though, on the regulation side, you've got different government agencies at different levels involved in regulation. So it's water is a very hard issue and challenge, because you've got federal, provincial, municipal, and each one kind of sticks to their lane or, silos or sticks their head in the mud. And it's hard to move, good sound data and results to regulation unless you have a champion. So are you hoping to maybe achieve or get a champion somewhere in those organizations that would, whether it's a particular lake you're working on or just in general?
One of the things that I have an undergraduate student who's working for us who is doing a survey of all regulations and how they're structured across Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, to better understand how regulations are formed, how they are then kind of separated amongst those different levels of government, and to what degree are they safety-based and just simply distance from shoreline, to depth-based, to sensitive areas. And you're right, you've got a large problem, because you've got these different levels of government, you've got different configurations of lake, different depths of lake, different habitats. It's hard to create one regulation nationally. It's hard to create one regulation Manitouwabing to really represent this. So I'm not sure, we're not here from looking at from a champion standpoint. We're hoping that this data is useful and supports what people are just better understanding of boat wakes and basically cottage lake environments. But we're not looking necessarily a champion. We're hoping that it does inform.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Well, it's one step. Oh, I'm not unmuted.
No, you're muted. You're good.
It's one step at a time, I'm finding, just put one foot in front of the other and keep going. Does anyone else have another question or a comment? No, I think that's it.
We got two.
Oh, Al has a question. Al, you need to unmute yourself, please.
And then Carrie has a question after Al.
Okay. Al, you're muted.
Okay, I know, I just got off, I just figured it out. I've made this statement before, and I think the best way to control it is shaming through Facebook. I know people are resistant to that, but as had been mentioned, I think by Chris or the former speaker, it makes a great deal of sense. All of these issues, shaming, because the other part is involvement of let's say the OPP, when we talked about boat speeds and setting up cameras so you can, get their registration and go back. If we had the, how would you say, the support of the OPP to do that? Okay, end of statement. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm not gonna with shaming, but rather when I mentioned about the Facebook page, it was just people commenting on it and understanding what it was, and it was really a driver to it. So it was a great social study. But one of the things we're hoping to be able to do in the next couple of years, and hopefully I can get back to the McKellar Fall Fair, is that of doing some public perception surveys, just better understanding what people know, what they don't know. Maybe that goes right back to Daryl's question about education. We also need to know, what is that baseline? What are people's thoughts of it? And better understand and kind of work through that one. But I'm not sure. I'm not going to comment on the shaming piece.
Okay,
Carrie.
well, understood. Yeah.
Carrie, I think you had a question.
Yes, I was wondering if your student who is looking at the different regulations around the world will also be taking a look at whether there's studies similar to yours that might back up what you're finding or refute or whatever, because water is water and boat wash, boat wake is boat wake everywhere pretty much. So will that be part of the survey? And then secondly, I was just going to say to your point, I think there's a lot of lack of understanding, particularly when people get all excited and buy a new boat and they're onto a new sport and they're going to try it. I think I would venture to say that probably there's no education about please don't use this close to shore or anything like that by the marinas selling the boats. It's, they're focusing on the fun and not that aspect, but not about how potentially in shallow areas, we could be wrecking areas that support our fish populations and our other wildlife, which most people do care about. So, we're trying very hard to learn and then, base information on studies like yours, like real factual information, and help educate people, because there's a large percentage that I think will care and just don't know.
Yeah.
I'm hoping anyways.
Yeah, going to the first part of your question about other studies, as I mentioned, we started our work in 2008 with some of the large ships that were on the Savannah River. And so we're one of the only groups in the world that does boat wakes. And so we're well connected to the groups that are working in Poland, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. And no, we're consistent, but every lake is different, every boat structure. So the work that they're doing on the Chesapeake Bay, very different types of boats, very different type of environment. So we're the only group that is currently working in the kind of the cottage country area, bedrock type shorelines, etc. And so that's it's because there's so few of us around the world who are doing this. It's hard to sometimes ground where we are at, because simply we're just don't have enough studies yet.
Well, I have to say we're awfully lucky that you're in our neck of the woods and doing what you're doing. Thank you very much.
I'm just trying to get myself back up to the cottage as much as I can.
Good move.
Al, did you have another comment or question?
Yeah, geez, I just lost it. Yeah, education, I think is key, but let's face it, the other end of it, anybody who's driving a boat has already been educated. They have to have a recreation boat license, and that's all part of it. I remember I took the test and it covered a lot. Now, maybe there's a lot more. Maybe the education part should be updated to the new information that's found, including the kinds of stuff that Chris has uncovered. That's it. Thanks.
Yeah, and you're right. But one of the things I'll note is that and it goes maybe to Daryl's comment earlier, once you get on the boat, it's fun. You get caught up in the moment and you're having fun. The other part is that sometimes when you're in that water, it's hard to figure out what is 30 meters from shoreline. And so sometimes there are just simple accidents in terms of too large of a wake. The other is that while we are taught in terms of boat safety, we're not taught how to drive a boat and plowing and speeds, etc. like that. There's a way that you can come in and slow down without truly plowing in and creating a massive wake. It's just some finessing that we just haven't learned to drive. It's like driving a stick. Daryl, you have your hand up?
Yeah, just, kind of going back to my earlier comment, and I recognize that the data is not all there yet, but one of the things that I'm sure you've considered is doing deputations to municipalities or wherever, because generally they get the brunt of, the calls into, and it would be good to be able to, demonstrate that, there's someone out there that's looking at this, and here are the results. And that may then, sort of increase the public perception or education and everything else to further along the cause, as opposed to, oh, this is just a theoretical university, study, and it really doesn't mean anything. I think, and granted, like I said, it's probably early on, but it's maybe something to consider in addition to the work with Safe Quiet Lakes, or, they have their annual meeting. I texted Carrie is that Chris would be a great speaker for our Lake Association AGM. I don't want to get you on the speakers tour, but the information and stuff, it's obvious, but it's not maybe as obvious to those that are, impacting it like they are.
Yeah, universities have historically done a terrible job of translating the research that they are doing, bringing it to the communities that which need it. A lot of the work that I do with respect to beach safety and rip currents, I actually literally seem to be doing a speaking tour for that and coastal erosion issues. And in fact, it's one of the things that I enjoy the most is trying to get out in front of and just talking about the research we're doing, figuring out what are some of the other needs that people have, so that we're really making a difference with what we're doing.
Great to hear. Thanks.
Steve has his question.
Yeah, not a question, more a comment. I think the whole issue is very complex. The intersectionalities between loss of fisheries, loss of loons, potential more algae blooms. I found we're at the market every week in the summer, and the best time to figure out what someone thinks is by talking to them directly and to discuss items. I know one day we had a young woman was going to join our association, and then she saw our no wake signs and said, "Oh, you hate my personal watercraft. I'm not joining this organization." And the person receiving that comment was like taken aback, and then she walked away. So it was a missed opportunity. But most people don't connect the dots between, the loss of the loons and wakes, or the loss of fisheries and wakes and phosphorus. The whole thing is so complicated that we really got to talk to people a lot more. Our members ourselves, we don't really know what they know. We're just getting to know what we know ourselves. So we started last year with the no wake signs. We got them out of Muskoka. We bought a quarter of all their signs and put them out. So we got 40 signs out there, and people were starting to make comments. One guy said to me, "Oh, it's disturbing the aesthetics of the lake." Oh, I said, "You want to join our committee?" That's what it sounds like you're saying. He says, "Oh, well, no." But it caught his attention, right? So it's one step. We haven't quite figured out the next step. We got some ideas, but we're going to try to dramatize things a little more. You got to get people's attention. You got to start talking to people a lot. And Jennifer has come up with an idea of getting smaller groups on our various lakes together, and maybe that's the way to go. I don't know. We're gonna work on it. So anyway, thanks for all your great work, though. The data helps a lot. It gives you extra talking points for sure, and we'll see what we can do.
Yeah, and one of the things to your point about the complexity of the situation, that's why I put in one of the last slides about it being having the social science, the public perception piece, because we don't know what people know, what they think it's doing, how they're connecting the dots. And that's one of the things that we're planning to be starting next summer. And things such as the market or the fall fair there in Dunchurch and Magnetawan are going to be key to better getting that information and figuring out what people know and don't, and how do we then maybe going back to build those education programs.
Sounds good, and I'm already looking forward to your talk next year when you talk about what you found on Lake Manitouwabing in the summer. So that'll be great, and we really are so thrilled to be part of this research and part of advancing the knowledge envelope in this area. And thank you so much for making it so clear tonight what you're doing and where we go from here.
Well,
Really
we're still
appreciate
looking
it.
for any spots, anybody has a shoreline that they would like to have a sensor put on their dock. It's put in a safe location. Just send me an email directly and I will then send you I will send you a link to a short survey that just gets you to help me identify approximately where your cottage is, but don't hesitate to reach out to me. Daryl, you said that the presentation is not working, file is too large. Maybe I also was just manipulating it on my end. I want to give it a try tomorrow morning. I'm just resyncing myself at the moment, so that might have been part of the problem. If you can't get to it, then let me know. Then we will. I'll find a different way to get it to you.
Thank you.
And Jim, thank you very much already. I've got your data already in the survey, and thank you for being willing to participate.
Good. Thank you so much, everyone. And especially Chris Hauser, thank you very, very much for your presentation.
No, thank you.
We're going to move forward to the regular committee meeting of the Lake Stewardship and Environmental Committee of McKellar Township.